Now, don't come at me in the comments just yet, but this Nintendo lawsuit is not only necessary, but might actually make the entire game industry better as a whole. I argue that this lawsuit will make Pokemon way better than it ever was, and if it doesn't, then it will make everyone else better instead. I love both Palworld and Pokemon, and I know everyone is going to call me a Pokemon fanboy or shill, but like everyone else, I want Pokemon to build a game on hardware that isn't worse than my PS2. Palworld did really scratch that itch for me, but at the same time, they committed some crimes against the game industry, and so it isn't a shock that Nintendo is coming after them. But that's not the question we need to answer. Does this lawsuit improve gaming? Does it improve Pokemon? And more importantly, does it slow down innovation? Before we get into the weeds, let's first figure out how likely it is that Nintendo wins this court case. According to Nintendo's press release, Palworld infringes on multiple patent rights. As many have pointed out, there are 2 US filed patents that reflect mechanics regarding capturing and riding creatures in a video game. However, this lawsuit was actually filed in Tokyo, and so we need to reference applicable Japanese patents. The Reddit user Yu breaks down the situation well and calls notice to a specific patent filed in Japan in 2021, with additions to the patent family filed in 2023, 2 more in February of 2024, and another pending since March of 2024. All enforceable since the very first filing in 2021, even though they're slightly different and are a part of the same patent family. The main patent that he argues is important here reads as follows. In the computer of the information processing device, switching between at least a first mode and a second mode based on the first operation input, in the first mode based on the second operation input, the aiming direction in the virtual space is determined and based on the third operation input. You know what? I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read it for yourself if you want. Anyways, Yu describes this nuance well and explains the patent as enforcing the following. They patented the ability to switch between 2 modes. The first one is throwing a capture item and determining if the capture was successful, and the second is releasing a monster to initiate a battle. Similar patents were actually rejected in the US, and this is an incredibly important distinction that I will cover later on in the video. Now, Japanese patent law is a little bit different to the rest of the world in a few ways that are important. The first is that its levels of inventiveness are more strict than in the USA. This basically means that if the enhancements to something are obvious, then they are more difficult to enforce, with more scrutiny in Japan. For example, if you invented a chair and then added a massage feature to it, this could be patented in the US, but would be much harder to patent in Japan, since it's an obvious improvement anyone might make to a chair. For the patent I would call the creature capture mechanic, it could be enforceable since it is actually quite nuanced in their documentation. It covers a really specific path of events, throwing an object, determining the capture success, and then making the object owned by the player. After all of that, the player can then also send out that object to do specific action. Every single element of this is actually reflected in Palworld, and dare I say it's the core game mechanic of Pokemon Legends Arceus and Palworld, so we can see where they're so similar to each other. Now, I do believe this is bad for innovation in gaming as a whole, but at the same time, nothing was stopping Palworld from designing their own mechanic. Although I'm inclined to agree, there's really no better mechanic than the game loop defined in Pokemon Legends Arceus. It's just too bad Palworld didn't launch before that game and eliminate any chance of Nintendo creating or enforcing such a patent. Now, as many might know, Nintendo is notoriously good at winning lawsuits, but that's more of a case of them not bringing lawsuits they have even the slightest doubt they could lose. So there is a strong chance they are successful with this. Now, before we get on to why I think this is good for the gaming industry, I want to say that Palworld essentially asked for this. So many of their creature designs look way too close to Pokemon and weren't simply inspired by them, okay? No one can argue that. They directly copied so many of their designs. Direhowl and Lycanroc, Nightwing and Braviary, Jet Dragon and Dragapult, and the most egregious, Boltmane and Luxray. This one shits me to death.
Okay, I said that out loud, right?
Now, Palworld actively chose to leverage the Pokemon IP and use that to their every advantage, which was wildly successful, and honestly, good on them. I don't love copyright infringement. I definitely think they shouldn't have done it as much as they definitely did, but if that was their strategy, it worked, okay? So although they flew way too close to the sun, I think it has actually set things in motion that will benefit the gaming industry in the coming decade. and bring a new golden age of gaming. As many of you already know, companies like Ubisoft have their stock price get decimated as they prioritize an agenda outside of genuinely fun gameplay. This is part of the reason that Palworld blew up the way it did. The appetite was revealed for playing a Pokemon game on stronger hardware with obviously modern game mechanics such as removing the turn-based battler and allowing your companions to help you in the world environment. This means that players are going to continue to want this gameplay, and it is never going to stop. Pandora's box has already been opened. Nothing Nintendo does can change that. This lawsuit can go one of two ways. Firstly, Nintendo loses, although unlikely, it would allow Palworld to grow and continue to expand, further pushing Pokemon to grow up, leave the Switch, and actively compete with them if they want their video games to continue to thrive. It would also inspire many other companies in Japan to use similar mechanics and develop games in the creature collector genre. But better still, Nintendo wins the lawsuit. The game industry has woken up, and Pandora's box has been opened. There is no going back on this, no matter what government enforces what patent. At this stage, this is like a Hydra. If Palworld gets shut down by Nintendo, 2 new games will pop up in its place, especially based in countries with more lax copyright laws. Many studios in the USA and even China will start to release similar games to close this power vacuum. More importantly, players will refuse to play future Pokemon games that aren't up to par and will boycott them altogether. Either way, someone is making a good new modern Pokemon game. Either the Pokemon company does, or some well-funded international game studio achieves this. In either scenario, people like myself who want Pokemon to grow and evolve will end up winning, and I'm excited for the new golden age of gaming.